really confusing about this. And by the way, this is from a source as well, who's kind of in this area, but I can't name them. Is what this exemption seems to have done is not all that much for Qualcomm, because it's not a huge amount of money for. It's not like it accounted for 60% of Qualcomm's sales.
Yeah, more like.
So it's not like
3 to percent or something.
Preventing Nvidia from selling AI chips to Chinese companies is a much more serious move. But this exemption hasn't really done a huge amount for Qualcomm, and all it has done is allowed Huawei to sort of keep its smartphone.
Well, I slightly disagree. This is the point I keep labouring. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're going to have a guest this week, but they're to bail at the last minute. Obviously, I wouldn't dream of naming and shaming, and hopefully they'll rebook. So it's just me, Ian and Pierre this week.
We haven't had one with just the three of us
we haven't had one for a while, no, because we're so fucking popular.
Mm-hmm. It's like a month.
And Pierre, you've got to, if you're going to butt in, you've got to make your jokes better than they were last week.
It's still the Dolby one.
Oh, that was the Dolby one that was a low point.
I've never heard of a person named Dolby besides the Dolby guy. Oop.
What about Thomas Dolby? She blinded me with science. Was that the one? Or was it Video Killed the Radio Star? No, that's the Buggles. She blinded me with science in the 80s. A bit before your time, Pierre.
Yeah, that's why.
There was a bloke called Thomas Dolby.
Mm.
And then there's Spinal Tap, where the wife comes in. She goes, everyone knows you don't do metal in Dobley.
What?
Dobley.
So that bit of Spinal Tap was... You know Spinal Tap, the film, yeah?
Yeah, of course.
It was where she comes in and there was that whole sort of Yoko Ono tension sort of going on. And she starts trying to poke her nose into shit all the more. And there's one bit where they're having some brainstorm and she goes, and she's just having a go at some recording. She goes, everyone knows you don't record metal in Dobley. And everyone's like, in what? I don't know, it's just one of those toe-curling moments.
Christopher Guest, he's married to Jamie Lee Curtis, right?
Yeah.
And then she was in a Tesla dealership buying a Tesla, and they were like, the dealer guy was like all happy, like, oh, there's a joke in the Tesla where the volume goes to 11, and she's like, yeah, no, my husband
wrote that joke.
Well, he delivered that line.
Yeah, no, they wrote the cast wrote it.
Oh, really?
The cast, because I just watched it the other day with.
I thought Rob Reiner. I mean, he probably wrote a bit as well.
We watched it the other day with my brother's girlfriend who'd never seen it before, so we wanted to watch it with her.
Which film's this?
This is Spinal Tap.
Oh, yeah.
No, the actual cast. So Michael McKean, Christopher Guest, Harry Shearer, the bassist who does a lot of voices in The Simpsons, and Rob Reiner. They wrote not just the script, they wrote the music.
What? That's
I know. It's a fucking good effort. And do you know they're doing a get together? They're like 50 years later.
Wow, that's so cool.
God knows how that's going to come out.
Oh, a bit of trivia. So the Dolby, the British guy who created the sound. What was his first name?
Brian.
No.
Oh, it's
Dave.
John.
No, it's a three. It's Ray. Oh, whatever. Anyway, let's move
Ray
on.
Dolby.
Ray Dolby. Yeah.
Ray's a good London name. We were talking just before we started recording, because we've got a guest who's hopefully going to be coming on next week who's from London. He's called Darren. We thought that was a good London name. And then we're going, Lee, that's an even better London sort of Essex name. But Ray, that's a good South East England name, I think.
Yeah. This is like the tangent of all tangents.
I know, we haven't even started doing anything yet.
We're already on a tangent.
What were the Cray brothers called?
Ronnie and Reggie.
Reggie's quite a good South East England name.
What about, what's Bob Hoskins' character in the Long Good Friday?
Muppet.
No.
Muppet Hoskins.
His character's name is Harold.
Harold, no, that's not so good.
No.
That was a missed opportunity, I think. Yeah. Okay, all right. So that was sort of pre-bollocks. Now on to the main bollocks. What are we chatting about this week? We got some really good feedback on the one last week, I thought. And that had an extended bit of bollocks in it. For people,
it's all relevant bollocks, though.
Well, for people who don't know, there's slight creative tension between me and Pierre on the matter of preliminary bollocks, whereas he thinks, with fairly good justification, that this is called the Telecoms.com podcast, and maybe we shouldn't wait fucking 45 minutes before talking about any telecoms.
Certain other people have provided that feedback as well.
Yeah, other people have as well. But then I think there are some other people who like the more Rogan-y, and let's face it, it works for Rogan. He's by far the biggest podcast in the world. The more sort of freewheeling, random stuff. And then that particular one, obviously the people who liked it, like Richard Fogg was kind about it on LinkedIn. I thought there was some really interesting chats to be had about PR there, and we came up with a few things. And some other people who have got in touch to say you're right about there's not enough background briefings and all that sort of thing, which definitely used to be more of a thing.
Shout out to Richard Fogg for the shout out.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That was cool. So that was all good fun. I've got to say, I started the last pod by saying how shit the weather was. That's changed in a week, hasn't it?
Well, it's going to get shit again next week.
It's going to get shit again next week. But
No, it's going to get cloudy.
It is. Cloudy and rainy and down to 18.
Well, it's only about 20 now, but when the sun's out...
24.
Oh, is it? It's that hot, is it? Anyway, the last few days have been lush. It's great walking in. I was delighted to see a lot of sort of summer wardrobes come out. I'll just leave that there. But,
I was wearing shorts yesterday.
Yeah, well, it was Pierre's legs I was thinking of. But just more generally, it's amazing. It's one of the things about, for people who listen to this, if maybe you live somewhere that doesn't have seasons, somewhere subtropical, we basically endure 6 or 7 months of shite. Mm. And then the first time spring properly arrives, which is like, well into May this year, April, there wasn't much going on in April, was there?
It's been one of the worst years so far.
Yeah. Then, everything suddenly changes. It's like you're living in a different country.
Yeah.
I quite like that.
This bloom of summer outfits.
Everything smells
summer
different.
Outfits, birds singing, everyone's got their shades on. Suddenly feel like you're in fucking Côte d'Azur or something.
Yeah. Everybody looks incredibly white.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
and then intensely
everyone,
red.
Yeah.
Soon after.
Yeah, there is something slightly unfamiliar about the summer garb. You're like, oh, hello, yeah. I'd forgotten I had this.
It smells musky.
Yeah, exactly.
Deep in the cupboard. Yeah. Anyway.
I got one other little bit of random bollocks. On the way down, it just stuck in my mind. I was in the train and I was... I go to the end of the train because when I get off at Blackfriars, you want to get off right at the end because that's where the exit is. Mm. And I was right next to the bogs and they were just locked. And often when the bogs are busted on the train, they just lock them permanently. And so that's what I figured happened. And so I got on at Hitchin. They were still locked in Stevenage, still locked at King's Cross. And then we got to Finsbury Park. And this woman, when it came to the station, suddenly unlocked the door, legged it out the bogs, grabbed a bag that had been sat like within eye shot of me, and then got out. So she was obviously fare dodging. Now, my issue isn't so much with the fare dodging. It's just that loads of people wanted to use that bog and they couldn't. It's just such a fucking selfish thing.
For the whole journey?
That must have been at least half an hour. And I don't know when she got on because it was already...
But doesn't she have to put a ticket through at the other end?
No, not at Finsbury Park.
Oh.
You can just get out, especially if you're getting on the tube. You just go straight onto the tube. So she obviously thought it through. It was a cunning plan.
I remember the days
I just felt like calling her out as just such a selfish thing to do.
Yeah, I used to do that sort of thing when I was a student. But I think it's acceptable as a student. It's not so acceptable when you're grown up.
Talking about students, I was reading The Spectator on the way down. There's one bit where we've had all these students, a sort of growing wave of students pitching up little mini like music festivals as a sort of fun way to protest against Israeli actions in Gaza. And someone from The Spectator had just gone along to one of them. And there was one little quote.
I read this, yeah.
There was one little quote I extracted to send to my mates because The Spectator's paywalled. So I have to just copy and paste stuff into messages. Yeah. So here's someone from the Spectator article. Someone said, do you want a tent, bro? Asked one protester. I explained that I was a reporter and was immediately whisked away to talk to a spokesman. Quote, Spectator. Yeah, I think that's left wing. All good. Which it isn't. And then it finished off by saying a girl who had come along for the day received a kefir tutorial, which is that tea towel that people associate with Palestinians.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, I don't think these people are really students anyway, most of them. They're just opportunists.
Well, do you know what I think?
Young layabouts with nothing better to do than...
Yeah, well, I think they probably are students, but the opportunist thing I buy into, I'm certainly not in this pod, talk about antagonising Pierre, going to go off on a big tangent about the pros and cons of the Gaza conflict. But I do think that, I think this has probably long been the case with student protesters, it's mainly just a bit of a laugh.
Yeah.
I don't think they're that serious. I mean, you've had stuff from the States where they've been going on about how the protesters themselves need humanitarian aid, which is always sort of deeply ironic when.
There was the time during the Vietnam War when they shot like 4
Yeah,
students.
Kent State. No, that was hardcore.
Just don't understand why they even did that.
No, well, God knows. I'd need to read up on it.
It's not like the capital. If they come with like weapons, fine, but they had nothing.
I get the protests more when it's with the Vietnam War, because it was something the US was directly involved in.
Well, also conscription. There was a massive self-interested element.
Whereas now I know the protesters would say, oh well, but the US and the UK supports Israel, but it's nuanced, isn't it? They're trying to be. I think there was even something in the BBC today about Biden threatening to withhold weapons and support from Netanyahu. And Netanyahu going off on one. So they're trying to be intermediaries. So I just have a problem sometimes with protests happening in countries that aren't really sort of directly involved in it anyway. And
I think nearly all
now. It's a bit weird.
I think nearly all of that student, and we're so culturally influenced by the States.
Yeah.
You saw it, for example, during the lockdown with BLM. Within days of that happening, we had students in Bristol chucking statues in the river.
Yeah, I mean, even more so in that case, because that was an incident that happened in America, a very specific incident that happened in America, that all of a sudden you find there's protests going on in
I just think there's a certain kind of either narcissistic or just recreational demo goer.
Yeah.
Because they turn into like little impromptu music festivals. I think in that article that I was reading from, someone said that the front lawn of King's College, Cambridge, looks like Glastonbury.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a giggle, but I just wonder how much of a fuck they actually give about the cause. Anyway. So yeah. All right. I haven't been to anything this week, but you have, Ian. Do you want to mention that before we get into what we're talking about?
I've been to 2 telecom events in the past week. One was a wedding, but it was kind of a telecom event as well.
How's that?
So it's
because it was boring and you spent all your time on your phone.
No, because the guy who got married was a guy that I met through telecoms.
Oh, okay, right.
He worked for a consulting firm, an analyst firm called Analysis Mason. It was Analysis at the time.
Yeah,
so I've known him since about 1999, I think.
Because you were there. Yeah.
Amit Nagpal. So
okay.
Shout out to him.
Congratulations, Amit.
He might even come on the pod at one point in the future. I have talked about trying to get him on because he's very knowledgeable about all things to do with.
And do you think he'd enjoy the bands?
Spectrum and. He'd enjoy it a lot. He follows. He'll hear this because he follows the pod.
Okay,
in fact, he just texted me immediately before we started saying, "I've just listened to the last week's." So,
cool.
The nice thing about that is I saw a bunch of people that I hadn't seen for about 20 years. He worked at Analysis, but actually has now gone on to work for the company. He left to set up his own company called Ether Consulting.
Okay.
And took a few people with him, and so there's a guy called Pierre Blanc who I'd not seen for like 20 years. He lives in Argentina now, but he was there, which is really nice.
Wow.
So it's kind
of over from Argentina.
Anyway. And they're all very, very smart people. They're incredibly bright guys, the people at Ether that I know.
Did you feel thick there? Then?
I did, yeah. They're the kind of people who make me feel like I don't really know anything. So that's another reason.
I've never let that be a barrier.
Yeah. And then I went to a Liberty Global organised event on Tuesday.
Which they invited me to. I'm sorry I didn't go.
Yeah, they mentioned that they had a really good time with you the last time they took you out.
And then I couldn't be asked to turn up to that thing.
They're trying to do some series of things, and this is one of them. You were obviously at the first one that I couldn't make. It sounded like...
That was entirely social.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, this was...
And that went on, I think I gave him a shout out, that went on till quite late.
Yes, they kind of mentioned that. This was not like that at all. This was a very sober panel with someone from...
Please, I gave it a miss then.
I mean, it was good people on it though. So they got the Chief Technology Officer of Liberty Global Group, so the guy who's... I mean, Liberty Global is mainly Virgin Media O2, I think, these days. It's probably its biggest constituent part. Yeah. But it does have a few other things as well. Then it's also got this 50% ownership stake in a company called Atlas Edge, which is like a data center company.
Right.
And the whole point, and they had the Chief Digital Officer, I think, of the UK from Microsoft there as well. Might have got his job title wrong, but he was definitely a senior executive on the UK side at Microsoft. And obviously the theme was very much about artificial intelligence and... all things associated and how Liberty Global sees itself using it and what some other issues are. So it was quite an interesting panel, I thought. But it didn't turn into one of those epic drinking sessions afterwards. So,
no.
Which you don't really want on a Tuesday. Anyway.
No, it kind of sets you back.
Yeah.
Although that next week might be a bit challenging. We're going to, just so you know, we're going to record the pod early next week because next Thursday I'm flying off to the Canaries where my brother lives and he's having his 50th birthday. And we're going to record on Wednesday, but I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to publish it. suppose unless you turn it around really quick and I can do it before I go to the airport
yeah.
on Thursday morning.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, we can chat about that.
You can do it
Our
on the
audience
beach.
doesn't need to know about these things.
You can do it on the beach.
Yeah. Well, it's just that once I get there, we're just gonna be on the lash for an extended
you won't do it
weekend.
on
So
the beach then.
you don't want me to going into our back end when I'm in that state. So we'll sort that, and then I'm actually hanging around and working from the Canaries for a bit, so we might have to do a remote one. Although you're travelling on that Friday, so we'll see how that Friday goes, which is the
Coming back on
24th. Okay,
What's the time difference with?
there's
the
no time
Canaries?
difference.
That's convenient, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is.
Oh, because it's
Just south.
Yeah, it's a bit weird. They probably should be in a different time thing. They're actually to the west of us, but I think you know what Europe's like. They like everyone to fucking get in line. And then we got half term the one after that. So following the one on Wednesday, you might have a couple of remote ones off us, audience. So apologies in advance for that, but life goes on. Okay, that's enough bollocks. I think no more bollocks from anyone. No. What are we going to chat about this week? I thought, Ian, both you and I covered a story about my headline was US inevitably revokes chip export licenses involving Huawei. I read your story, and I always find it interesting. As I've said to people loads of times on the pod, Ian and I do not compare notes on our writing, and very occasionally, for example, if I know he's covering something and I haven't got the press release, I might ask him about it, or he might, or we might ask for a sanity check if one of us isn't sure, which would again normally be me asking Ian. In fact, you hardly ever ask me about anything. What are you saying? Are you saying I'm fucking stupid?
No, I'm sure I ask you things.
But on the whole, but from pod to pod, we don't necessarily interact unless there's some evening larks to be had. And then we don't talk about telecoms then, do we?
Hardly ever.
Just talk. You think this is bollocks? You should hear what we talk about on those occasions. But anyway, then I did. I noticed your headline. Your headline was US shuts Qualcomm door after Huawei has bolted. Now, I actually used the horse door and the bolted metaphor in my story. So it's funny how when great minds think alike.
Yeah.
So I think we'll cover that. And it's just really juicy. There's probably some non-telecoms geopolitical tangents to be had there, but
Yeah.
I think it's good fun to chat about.
Yeah.
Then there was one we were going to chat about last week, but we ran out of time, thanks in part to the extended preliminary bollocks, which was to do with Open RAN, Ian's favourite topic. So we're going to talk about the thing that we were going to mention last week, and you've also done at least one other Open RAN piece since then. So we'll probably get into
I
that.
think we were going to talk specifically about Samsung and how it's doing, but it is very much tied in with the Open RAN story, I suppose. So I can sort of lump those together and
cool.
chat about what's going on there, just for a change, because you never talk about Open RAN, Scott.
Well, actually, it's been a little while, so we've got some catching up to do.
Yeah.
And then we're going to finish off. I think I want to do it's a sort of slightly quirky one. What I wrote this morning before I came in here. A new Apple came out with a advertisement, a video ad for its new iPad, and the whole point they're trying to make is that it's really, really thin. Apple's just for some reason obsessed with its products being thin. I think that's what do they call it? Fattest.
Well, so they
body
can be broken
positivity
more
is
easily.
something like that. Well, yeah, I mean, I think they just think it's more elegant, whatever. Who cares?
I thought they got away from that obsession because they did the
Apparently
the
not.
AirBook, didn't they? Whatever it's called, the MacBook Air.
They even compared it to the old iPod Nano, and it's thinner than that.
Right.
Because they were like, the processor is consuming less juice, so we could either make it last longer or make the battery smaller, and they went for the battery smaller.
Yeah.
Why don't they have two versions?
Yeah,
They've got
fat
a big
and thin.
R&D budget, haven't they? They could do that.
I think they
Fat
probably
ass iPad.
research like 14 hours is fine for most people, and
Yeah.
it's better in the hand. I don't know.
My MacBook, I'm very disappointed with the battery life on it. I feel I'm just generally disappointed with my MacBook.
Because you are the one just before the
Well,
M.
it's probably got an Intel processor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The M one is crazy.
But even so, I still expect it to last longer than 3 hours, which is what it does.
Really?
Yeah, and then it conks out. So eventually,
I think it's because your journalisming is so intense
well
that it just
maybe.
eats up the battery.
I try to hit the keyboards with a lighter touch. Yeah.
I like the thought of that, but I don't think it's to do.
Yeah, just the sheer weight of journalism.
The computer's sweating. The story is too much for me.
So anyway, they've done an ad, and it's kind of fallen flat on its face, and loads of people think it's not just bollocks, but like offensive or whatever. That standard thing that people say when they want to censor you these days. And Apple's basically
But it's
shat
not,
itself.
really.
So that's quite funny.
Right.
No, it's not. Although, I mean, I'll read some of what I wrote.
It's annoying.
Yeah, and it's a bit rubbish.
But
but
don't read it now.
No, but I'm saying I'm going to. So those are 3 things we're going to talk about. So there we are. Let's get back to it. So, I mean, I'll start off
Yeah.
by doing my coverage of
Because I
this
can't
Huawei
remember
thing.
the actual news bit of it,
Mm.
of the Huawei Qualcomm thing. Oh, yeah, there was a DOC move, wasn't there?
Well, so you focus on Qualcomm, I focus more on Intel.
Okay.
Because you
I didn't even
channelized
mention Intel.
you channelized Bloomberg and I channelized Reuters and the FT.
Mm.
For people who listening who've never heard that term before, channelizing is a sort of inside baseball term.
Do too much journalising.
No. I just say any time where you're reporting on something that was someone else's scoop, I just call journalism. That's all. But it's hardly a scoop, as I'll get into.
Yeah.
I mean, it's increasingly obvious how the channels of communication work.
The thing
like
one thing I thought was interesting about the Qualcomm side of it with Bloomberg was that they didn't really seem to know, even in the Bloomberg story, what licenses Qualcomm had to serve Huawei, which I'd written about a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
But anyway, you start off and
it's entirely because I can't prove this, but I'm fairly sure that in 99% of cases where you get Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, FT, Reuters, whoever, saying sources familiar with the matter, the inference is always that it's some kind of clandestine deep throat sort of bloke in shades in an underground car park giving you inside information. And incidentally, we should correct the record on even deep throat, which is the Watergate all the president's men thing. Because I totally fell for the fact that it was this very unstructured rogue whistleblower type of person, whereas it was actually the deputy director of the FBI.
Yeah.
And he had a double agenda. One, I think it was CIA people who were involved in the Watergate break-in. So he there's always interagency aggro.
Yeah.
And also he didn't like Richard Nixon. And he basically indirectly ended up being responsible for him resigning.
Yeah, everybody's always got a vested interest.
Exactly.
Nobody ever just talks to journalists because they think it's the ethical thing to do.
But you will get some people like Edward Snowden or in fact, this is how you can tell that they're unauthorized leaks, because someone like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange or whatever, they're the ones that get persecuted.
Yeah.
In Julian Assange's case, they want to, they've almost persecuted him to death. Edward Snowden's case, he's had to hide in Russia because he knows if he comes back to the US, he'll get locked up forever.
Yeah.
And they always go, well, they've broken the law because they've given away national security secrets. You get national security leaks to the press all the time. So what they're really saying is this was an unauthorized leak, whereas if it's just our chaps doing it for whatever agenda they've got, that's all right. I think that's fucking hypocrisy.
Qualify what I said, because I think there are some people for whom the vested interest is being ethical. Like, for instance, the one, I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's a film made of it even about the guy in the tobacco company who sort of, because they're sort of falsifying information about the dangers of smoke. Wasn't Russell Crowe in it? It was that 60 Minutes thing, wasn't it? Pierre would know, surely. There was a film with Russell Crowe in where he's like a whistleblower on Philip Morris or whatever the tobacco company is. The Insider, is it?
Michael Mann, The Insider.
It's quite a good film, actually.
Yeah.
But he was, I mean, presented as a kind of person doing it for sort of ethical reasons.
As well. Yeah.
So, there are people who do it for that reason. But,
as a journalist, I love whistleblower stories.
Well, that's better. That's a better sort of reason to write about it, I always think, in those instances, isn't it? That you kind of feel your company's doing a bad thing. And
just because you've got a vested interest doesn't mean it's not good that the stuff gets into the public domain. I just think it's important that people understand how the game is played.
Yeah.
And so what happened here? The story, at risk of burying the lead, was that the US basically set up a framework when it designated Huawei it had this entity list, didn't it, about 2 or 3 years ago?
Well, it still has it.
Yeah. It created the entity list 2 or 3 years ago, where basically any companies, i.e. any companies that come from China principally, but America's also got a short list of antagonistic countries, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Yeah, I don't know if the entity list started then, or it just wasn't publicised.
Or maybe that was just the first time we were aware of it. Maybe it had been sitting there for ages.
Yeah, because if you look at the entity list, which I have done, there's a lot on it. There's a huge
lot of entities.
There's a lot of entities on the entity list, and there's a lot of them that aren't Chinese, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, ones that you'd expect to be on it, like sort of dodgy, Afghan companies that, were run by the Taliban, and you wouldn't want.
Yeah, but,
That sort of
even
thing.
that,
It's
the way you characterize it there, they're dodgy and run by a Taliban according to the US security state.
Yeah.
This is part of the problem. I'm not saying they're wrong, but they have the unilateral power to just go, right, that's dodgy, and we say it's dodgy.
Yeah.
But just as unilaterally, they can go, we say this isn't dodgy, and this is the bind they find themselves in regarding export licenses to Huawei.
When it comes to the Taliban, I'm sort of with them on that one. I have less of a problem with the Taliban being on the entity list than I do with certain other companies.
Well, I mean, yes,
It's
no, obviously
like-
I'm not a fan of the Taliban, but
It's like I'd probably put the Nazi Party on the entity list, if they're around. The German, Nazi Party, I'd probably have them on there.
no, but you can get into, you can go down a real rabbit hole of, who's
you
dodgy
can.
and who's not,
You
and
can,
how
but
we
there are
measure
some
it.
that are clearly one companies. I mean, having just fought a war against the Taliban
And lost, ultimately.
I guess.
I mean, the Taliban were back
In
in
a kind of
power within
Vietnam
seconds of their
sense.
last flight out of Bagram.
Yeah, well, it's a bit Vietnam-like, wasn't it? I suppose.
was.
But having sort of blamed them essentially for what happened on September the 11th, I can sort of see why they'd not want to.
Yeah, which I think was bollocks.
Well, they were certainly protecting. I mean, we're really getting on a tangent.
Yeah,
They were
yeah, I
certainly
think-
protecting Osama bin Laden.
No,
weren't
that's a
they?
good point. But they weren't necessarily
It wasn't like
responsible
the
for it.
Iraq situation, which really was kind of very nothing
Made
to
up.
do with it.
Yeah, those the WMDs and
Yeah.
sexing up the dossier.
Do you want-
but that,
you got one?
yeah, but that's all part of the point I'm making, which is just the mechanism of communication between the state, and in this case, we're talking specifically about the US state, and within that, often the security state. In fact, there's another quick little tangent I'll remind. I was listening to one of my favourite podcasts on the way down, which is called The Fifth Column. And for people who like last week's bit talking about PR, this Fifth Column is the best podcast I listen to that focuses on journalism and the mechanics of journalism and the mechanics of how information gets fed into the journalistic sphere and then how it gets disseminated with or without. Because proper journalism, you should be extremely suspicious of everything.
Yeah.
But you get a hell of a lot of journalistic outlets, especially ones that have developed good relationships with the state, for example, who will just repeat what they're given verbatim without any, but on the other hand, they could be talking bollocks, sort of caveats.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm critical of. Anyway, the Fifth Column's brilliant on that. And they had a bloke called Jacob Siegel on, who wrote a really long piece, like over 100,000 words, on what he calls something like
That's a book.
Yeah, something like the misinformation industrial complex. I might look it up because it's really worth. And he's got an amazing voice. He's got this sort of really husky, deep voice. He sounds like something like a Raymond Chandler book or something like that. Let's see.
The Big Sleep.
Yeah, that sort of thing. So yeah, okay. So
Is it The Big Sleep or is it the Big? I can't remember. I haven't read any Raymond
Yeah,
Chandler
so-
for ages.
I think he called it the hoax of the century.
Right.
And yeah, the great disinformation hoax. Basically, he's just talking about how the whole use of words like misinformation, disinformation, all these little caveat. 1300s, not 100,000. I don't know where I got that from. And he wrote it on Tablet, which is someone who writes for. So it's called Tablet. It's called A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century.
1,300 words.
Yeah.
Oh, that's like the size of one of my articles. That's impressed now.
No, 13,000 actually, I think.
13,000.
Let's-
What is it, Scott? Tell us.
It is 13,000.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that's quite long.
Yeah, but it's really worth. I mean, I haven't read all of it, but it's worth a look at. And it's just basically all about the information war. It's all about how you've got so many different people trying to control information, obviously to suit their agendas. And obviously there's baddies doing it, but there's increasingly massive. You know how we get like Ofcom's being given this censorship role, and they go, "Hey, we're going to stamp out misinformation." Well, governments and politicians and security state use disinformation all the time. A most classic example, the most flagrant example of that being the Russiagate hoax for Trump during pretty much the whole time he was in power. They just made up some shit about him being controlled by Vladimir Putin that turned out to be complete bollocks.
Golden showers and all that.
All that stuff, yeah. And it's just proven to be bollocks. But loads and loads of media reported it because they were getting it from the deep state, which was antagonistic to Trump for many understandable reasons. Deep state was going, yeah, he's basically working for Vladimir Putin. And they just fucking credulously repeated it.
I think one of the problems with the US media at the moment is it's lost its critical eye. Some newspapers. That's
pretty much what I'm saying.
I mean, and the worst culprit, I hate to say it, because it used to be a brilliant newspaper at one time, I think. And when you're talking about scoops in Vietnam, it's obviously very significant. Is the New York Times, which has just become. It's interesting because I was listening to a podcast on a run this morning. That is the only one I listen to. Is the history one that the two Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook do. But they
go the fifth column.
Right,
I think you'll really enjoy it.
So the series
they're really funny as well.
The series they're doing at the moment is about Custer. General Custer, known for Custer's Last Stand, but they're not up to that yet. His role in the Civil War. And there was coverage of him in the New York Times, and they're sort of like sniggering again. We love the New York Times, don't we, Dominic? And you can tell that they're sort of referring to the fact that it's incredibly biased these days in certain ways.
I can imagine they'd have some sort of retrospectively woke take on him or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I get the feeling with the two of them that Tom Holland's a little bit more kind of inclined to be woke on some things, and Dominic Sandbrook definitely not.
It's very skeptical.
But I think even them, both of them, are kind of looking at the New York Times thinking they've sort of gone down this road too much.
I mean, they're all guilty of things like audience capture, and there's some good reasons for it, like we spoke about a little bit last week with Howard about how so much advertising money went out of media when the likes of Google and Facebook turned up.
Yeah.
The temptation is to get into audience capture and just basically cater exclusively to a little niche of the market rather than try and appeal to everyone at various times. Anyway,
what happened with the Qualcomm thing? Anyway,
yes, exactly.
Massive, we've definitely buried the lead.
I was about to steer us back.
We've buried the lead in an Ian Morris-like way here.
Yeah. So basically, America's got itself in a bind because on one hand, it wants to inhibit Chinese technological development. And more on that later on in my coverage. But on the other hand, loads of American companies make a ton of money flogging stuff to China or flogging stuff to the Chinese market. You know, you look at Apple alone.
Yeah.
And then you get other things like, I don't know, the NBA. Apparently Chinese are well into basketball.
Yeah.
And you've had all sorts of little panics in the past where one basketball player's gone, how come they're being such bastards, those people in, where's it called? Uyghurs. And then China's gone, that bloke's out of order for saying that. And then the NBA's had a freak out because they get so much money out of China. And, and you've had, I think you've had Disney censor certain films according to Chinese. So there's lots of conflicts there. And again, I don't necessarily criticize any of those things in the context of commercial self-interest. But at the same time, you'll get people virtue signaling about this, that, and the other. We're talking about, people demoing about Gaza, but not other stuff. So it's all very selective. Anyway, so the way they try to reconcile these two conflicting interests is to set up this licensing scheme where certain companies like Intel and Qualcomm can appeal to the, I think it's called the Department of Commerce that runs this stuff, and say, can we have a special license to flog this shit to Chinese companies? And in the context of this story, explicitly to Huawei. And for a while, they just going, yeah, all right then.
Yeah.
And there's certain things they won't let them do. Like we've spoken before and probably will again in this segment about how hard China's trying to, how hard the US is trying to stop China getting hold of the latest generations of chips.
Yeah.
So they'll have certain things like they're forcing Nvidia to send sort of slightly dumbed down versions of their AI chips to China and that sort of thing. And so they've been doing all these licenses, and your reporting might decide that the provenance of this latest move is different. But I basically, from what I saw, I traced it back to the launch that Huawei did. When did I write the story? So I wrote a story on April the 15th. US politicians upset by Huawei launch containing latest Intel chip. And so Intel just launched a chip called the Intel Core Ultra. And Huawei, I think, deliberately launched a laptop called the MateBook X Pro Core Ultra.
Right.
So they basically used the branding of the Intel chip in the name of their new laptop.
Right.
And so then bunch of US politicians went, hold on a fucking sec, what's going on here? How come Huawei's able to use Intel chips in its latest laptop? And the answer is because Intel got a license to flog them.
Yeah.
And so then they freaked out. They sent a letter, and I'm going to get onto that in a bit, but there's so much I could say that I'm going to stop in a sec because I'm not giving you a chance. And cut a long story short, there was a political freak out. And so now they decided belatedly, and this is where I used the same turn of phrase as you. So I said in my concluding of my opening paragraph, I said, so it seems licenses are granted until Huawei launches a product that uses US components. Then the stable door is shut after the horse has bolted.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. They basically revoked these licenses that have been in place for years, and it seemed to be in response to a quite trivial but relatively high-profile product launch that got the attention of politicians. So that's really what happened. But I'll shut up now. I have got more to say on it, but
Yeah, I mean, the Intel thing I didn't look into as much, and but I think one of the funny things about the Intel move is because it got quite a lot of coverage, as you say, it was Bloomberg that broke it, and then I think some other
it was Bloomberg that broke it, was it?
I think it was Bloomberg.
Well, that's an interesting thing, so I'll get back to that because neither Reuters nor the FT referred to Bloomberg.
Right. Well, maybe I think sometimes what these newswires do is they go, oh, look, Bloomberg's written about this, we'll phone up our sources, and they say the same thing, and they don't go, oh, Bloomberg wrote it first, and we just sort of followed up. Because
I think what happened,
like they got it, but
I think what happened is it was controlled leak to a bunch of them all at the same time.
Maybe it could have been. But the thing about the Intel, I mean, the gist of my coverage is really that this doesn't really make any difference at all to either probably Qualcomm or Huawei on the sort of Qualcomm ban side. It might indirectly affect Qualcomm a bit more. The Intel stuff I see being perhaps even less impactful because, well, let's be honest, how big a deal is laptop sales to Huawei? I mean, they're not known as a laptop developer, are they? They have their various business divisions, of which I think the one they now call ICT is probably the biggest. It used to be the device making side, but the device making side is actually driven by smartphones. That's what they're kind of mainly into. So, you know, they're going after. I mean, the whole this is the funny thing about this. I always think is that the whole concern about Huawei allegedly is that 5G is such an important technology and will change the world, and it's going to go into fighter jets and insulin drips and these things that we definitely don't want the Chinese anywhere near that because they could bring down
because they could just press the fucking nuke button,
and people are getting upset about laptops and
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. You know, they're connected devices, I suppose. So maybe I'm downplaying it.
No, you're not. I completely agree. In fact, I'm going to go a step further than you.
Yeah, but so the Qualcomm side of it that you didn't talk about. What happened with Qualcomm that I understand from sort of doing former digging around before this story came out is they got their exemption came. When were the so-called Capitol riots? January 2021.
They got their straight after the election.
They got an exemption to sell 4G application processing units to Huawei in December 2020. Like, so basically
that's still granted by Trump.
Dying days of the Trump presidency, they got this exemption, which MediaTek, by the way, which is the other big company in that space, the three big ones in the space actually are MediaTek, Huawei, and Huawei via HiSilicon, and Qualcomm.
Yeah.
And MediaTek didn't get one, which is quite interesting.
Exactly, which is such bollocks, isn't it?
Because it's Taiwanese. So
it's such hypocrisy. I mean, that further augments and supports my case that the only reason they're doing it is because they're trying to placate presumably important donors like the people who run Qualcomm.
Yeah.
And keep them happy.
The interesting thing is if you look at, so I got sent some information showing very, very detailed information showing the kind of market share of application processing units in Huawei devices over time. And they'd been slowly phasing out Qualcomm chips and moving to HiSilicon stuff for quite a few years. And they had some MediaTek in there as well. And then when this kind of exemption came in, you look at the way this chart changes, all of a sudden Qualcomm's market share within Huawei devices starts to grow quite a lot because what they were unable to do is have their HiSilicon designs made by TSMC because of the ban, essentially because TSMC is a big foundry in Taiwan that makes the
world.
Chips.
Yeah. And especially good at cutting edge.
And especially good at cutting edge, which you need for smartphones. It's all the smaller stuff is going into smartphones, basically, the state-of-the-art stuff. And they couldn't get their HiSilicon chips made by TSMC because TSMC uses American tooling, essentially. They use
Yeah,
They use things
all
like
that sort of thing.
applied materials, and I think they also use Dutch equipment that was is sort of
ASML.
prohibited
Yeah.
under different sort of rules.
Well, we've spoken about it lots in the
Yeah.
pod before. That extreme ultraviolet is probably, in fact, almost certainly the only way you can make anything 7 nanometer and below at a decent yield.
Yeah, I spoke to someone else this week who I can't say because it was off record, and he about the DUV stuff and being able to do it with DUV.
With
And
multiple
by the way, this
patterning
guy's
or
a chip
whatever.
expert.
Okay, well, fair enough. I obviously
And
defer to that.
So he said you can do it with DUV, and he basically the yields aren't as good. But this idea, because I think one of the things we were talking about before is that if you do it with DUV, it's completely unprofitable.
Well, so I took
He
it.
was-
Like cards on the table. I pretty much single source it from the public statements of Richard Windsor from Radio Free Mobile, and his assertion is that 7 nanometer on DUV using multi-patterning or whatever it's called, is so inefficient as to be economically unviable.
Well, this guy, that's the thing he would, I think,
He'd push
take
back
issue
on.
with.
Fair enough.
Like the yields aren't as good, but it's not like you do it and it's a disaster and you just wouldn't even consider doing it economically. It's not that bad. So
it'd be great to get a definitive numerical thing, like
It would.
our yields from EUV 80% and DUV 50%
it would be really
or
good,
something
and
like
it would
that.
be actually a really big story.
Yeah.
Because a lot of like what we're seeing with Huawei's kind of recovery, I guess, that you see in their headline figures and all this, and apparently people are queuing up to buy these devices and they're going on sale.
Well, they're booming in China.
Yeah, we don't really know the details of what's going on at the financial level and how much money they're able to make from it. And everybody's always suspicious about Huawei financials.
Well, they just had some quarterlies out recently where they were they were great, but there were hardly any data, was there?
Exactly, and they just don't release that much when they do their reports in the way that Ericsson, Nokia, or
and there's all sorts of other ways in which even if we're not going to point a finger of dishonesty at Huawei, there's all sorts of ways those numbers could be massaged by state support.
Yeah, they can. To go back to the Qualcomm stuff, so they couldn't get their own high silicon chips made, so they basically fell back on Qualcomm to keep their device business, even though they were using Qualcomm chips over this period, wasn't doing very well. But it kept it going.
Yeah, but you know why that is.
Well, a lot of it was to do with the sale of a big smartphone business. They actually
but it was also Android.
Yeah,
they can't have proper Android.
There's all sorts of reasons. Revenues went down. One of the big reasons is they sold a big unit which is now Honor, isn't it?
Yeah.
They couldn't get.
They sold it.
They sold it.
Yeah, but they've still got control of it.
Exactly.
It's just at arm's length.
We don't know. But
it's like BT selling OpenReach.
Yeah. They, like you say, massive impact obviously from the Google thing, not being able to get Google apps on your devices. I think that's probably maybe bigger than anything.
Well, it's a deal breaker outside of China, but increasingly, as I'm sure you're just leading up to, not a deal breaker inside China.
Yeah. And they had Qualcomm. Qualcomm's license covered 4G application processing units, but not 5G. They actually made that very clear themselves in their own filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Maybe that was the license condition.
That was the license condition. They can't sell 5G. So these chips that Qualcomm was allowed to sell, which Bloomberg seemed to be quite confused about. I noticed in their coverage what they were selling. It's actually the Bloomberg guys had done their delving into the SEC filings, you can see what they were allowed to sell. They were allowed to sell 4G application processing units. They actually say it.
Are you trying to imply that sometimes journalists just churn out a story in an hour?
It's just a bit like, what are they allowed to sell? They've said what they're allowed to sell. So
that's my fucking forte. Is doing a half decent story in an hour or two.
Yeah, but these guys had actually had a phone call from the DOC.
Yeah, and it's Bloomberg, isn't it?
Yeah, but
expect better of them.
Yeah, and then so the reason I think the whole thing's futile is because we've had this. We've basically been talking about it. They came out with last September. They came out with their big announcement of the Mate 60 Pro. I think there's even a newer device now, isn't there?
Pura.
That's it.
Yeah.
Where they found this workaround to get high silicon designs done for application processing units done by.
Is it called Kirin? Is the chip?
It's called Kirin. Yeah. It's on 7 nanometer design. Yeah. So this is the interesting thing.
Which is better than they're supposed to be able to do.
Well, the previous Kirin chips were 5 nanometers when they were using TSMC.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So this is an interesting thing of what they had a Kirin chip advertised on their website. I'm pretty sure of this on promotional literature you can dig out from Huawei sort of website that actually
Which
has
would
the
have
old
been
Kirin
which would have been the
design,
cutting edge TSMC predecessor
doing
at the
5
time.
nanometer stuff.
Well,
That was
they're on 3 now and moving towards 2. Is that right?
Exactly. And the ones that they're doing with the Mate 60 Pro and presumably this newer one are 7 nanometer. Basically, people have done Western companies.
So
have
it's
done
like 2
teardowns.
generations behind what you can get if
Yeah.
you're still in bed with TSMC.
Yeah, but it's still obviously pretty good, and people
Yeah.
are quite happy to go out in China and buy it because if we listen to Counterpoint Research and Omdia as well, actually, they had their smartphone stats out this week, I think, and all these other analyst firms saying that it's interest in this device is that explains why Huawei's consumer business did pretty well last year. Probably do even better this year because it's only September, obviously, that this was launched. They've got this newer one out now.
Again, you wonder how much state support they're getting for
Yeah.
things like, I don't know, offering like interest-free financing or something.
Yeah,
like that.
totally. But what they're doing is they're sending these designs to a Chinese foundry called SMIC that hasn't
Which is
got
their main foundry,
which
isn't it?
hasn't got EUV tools from ASML, but it was apparently able to get DUV tools because they were still selling DUV equipment to China until quite recently.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden,
And they will have just bought everything.
yeah,
they could
and the
fucking
Dutch
get
all of a
off
sudden last year went, oh, we're not going to let you sell DUV stuff either. But it was too late by then because they've already got a load of it. So,
But you can still have a schmuck and a pancake.
yeah. So the other guy that I spoke to this week, which kind of backs up what Richard Windsor wrote, but the only dispute between them was this issue of how
the
much profit
yield
you can make.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing basically. Is they're using double patterning or whatever it is, quadruple patterning. I don't know what it is, but it's a technique you can use with DUV, which is an older generation technology to get 7 nanometer chips when normally it'd be better to do it with EUV. Really, you get sort of better results.
Isn't
but you can still
ASML
get
like
away with it.
one of the biggest companies in Europe now?
ASML might be the biggest tech
biggest?
company. It
tech
might be the
company.
biggest company. I don't know actually, but it's pretty big. Yeah,
Let's
it's bigger
see.
than you would think it would
I'm
be.
going to go ASML market cap. You carry on.
And so this is the thing about both this ban that's
Sorry to
come
butt
into
in.
force now.
So
Yeah, go on.
ASML market cap 350 billion euros. That's got to make it
That's
pretty fucking big, isn't it?
Yeah, it might be then. Because the only ones that go much, much higher than that are the US sort of tech firms, aren't they? They're not
Right.
real companies.
I don't know, someone like SAP or...
I doubt SAP's worth anywhere near that much.
No, I'm just thinking
I
of
would
tech
still be
companies.
even
What are other big
close.
European companies?
Well,
I suppose-
it'd be interesting to know what ARM's... But is ARM separately
I
listed?
wasn't that far off with SAP. They're 216 billion, but they're still way below ASML.
Okay.
Anyway,
I
carry
mean,
on.
this is quite depressing looking at the share prices of companies like Ericsson and Nokia and BT and Deutsche Telekom actually does quite well, but most of the other ones are really, really bad these days. It's
Ericsson market cap, I've only got it in krona. It's about 200 billion krona.
it's probably about 20 billion or something.
Right. Yeah.
Pierre's going to look it up.
As of May 2024, it has a market cap of 18 billion dollars.
There you
Accenture,
are,
but it's not
yeah.
really tech, but it's 64 billion US.
Accenture's not a European country, though, a company.
Isn't it?
It's Yankee.
Oh, you're right. Yeah,
Thing.
actually, yeah.
What was I saying? So I think these DOC bans that are coming in now that stop Qualcomm from selling these 4G APUs, application processing units, to Huawei, the thing that it's been allowed to sell since late 2020, it's a very futile move because Huawei's basically got its own high silicon chips to a point where they can now get them done by SMIC, and the market's basically moved in that direction anyway. People want 5G smartphones. You look at what Qualcomm's got to say about it. I mean, I think it's probably generated. The estimate I got is that someone thought it's probably made about $1.5 billion for Qualcomm in terms of their sales to Huawei over the last kind of few years of, while they've had this ability to sell 4G application processing units. So a company that made about, I think their revenues last year, I might be wrong on this, but I think it's about 35 billion, their revenues last year.
So that's a decent chunk.
But it's going down. I mean, their own estimates were, this is before, by the way, because they were getting asked by this on analyst calls before this update came out this week, was that the Huawei business would be relatively insignificant from about October onwards.
Right.
In fact, not insignificant, no revenues.
Yeah,
from
and I
Huawei.
think
because they've moved to their own stuff
exactly.
now.
And I think that's all the Americans have tried to do with these licenses is cushion the fall.
Yeah.
They've gone to people like Qualcomm and Intel. They've gone, look, in the long term, you have to stop selling to these people because we've got a political imperative to starve them of your
The thing I find strange about it, though,
but they didn't just let it get cut off straight away.
But the thing I find really confusing about this, and by the way, this is from a source as well, who's kind of in this area, but I can't name them, is what what this exemption seems to have done is not all that much for Qualcomm, because it's not a huge amount of money for. It's not like it accounted for 60% of Qualcomm's sales.
Yeah, more like
So it's not like
3 to
I mean,
percent or something.
preventing Nvidia from selling AI chips to Chinese companies is a much more serious move. But this exemption hasn't really done a huge amount for Qualcomm. And all it has done is allowed Huawei to sort of keep its smartphone.
Well, I
business
slightly
sort of
disagree.
alive.
This is the point I keep labouring. I think it's done a lot for Qualcomm in terms of, if you think about how public traded companies work, they're kind of obsessed with their quarterlies.
Yeah.
And so, if let's say in 1999, Qualcomm was getting 10% of its wedge from Huawei,
Yeah.
and it's going to eventually get to zero. They could have done a hard cut-off where it went from 10% to zero, and then that would have caused a massive shock in their quarterly numbers. I think they've lobbied the US government, and what they've done is give them a gentle landing, where they've just given them a license to sell them.
But it's not even close to 10%.
But maybe it was back in the day. I don't know.
But
the point isn't the numbers. I just picked an arbitrary number. I just think the reason they give the license is for no reason other than to throw a bone to their own domestic industrial champion.
Here's the downside for Qualcomm, and here's the indirect impact. I think is this is actually not really to do with the DOC move. This was going to happen anyway, but the resurgence of Huawei in the Chinese market, and it's winning market share now quite quickly, apparently, at the expense of other both Western,
specifically smartphones.
Yeah, so Huawei is now picking up market share at the expense of some of its rivals, I think, and also Apple a little bit is sort of under pressure. Qualcomm has a huge amount of business with other Chinese companies.
Xiaomi, Oppo.
All of it. It named them on their last earnings call. It said these are all our customers. Basically, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, they're all like using Qualcomm processors.
Yeah, because they don't have high silicon. Yeah, exactly.
They get all their stuff from. So
they'll get the full Snapdragon.
This is the bizarre thing about US policy is that Huawei's a really bad company, but all these other Chinese companies aren't.
Xiaomi's all right.
But TikTok isn't. But this one's all right.
It's completely incoherent.
It's totally incoherent. All these companies are still allowed to go and get their chips from Qualcomm. And the danger for Qualcomm,
and you can still buy Lenovo laptops in the States.
Here's the risk for Qualcomm now is that if
servers,
Huawei does take market share from people like Vivo and Xiaomi and Oppo and these other ones, that is very, very bad news for a company that's making so much of its money from selling to device makers that are Chinese.
Yeah.
Because a lot of their sales are concentrated, obviously, in the Chinese market. And if the popularity of this phone is such that Vivo and Oppo and all those Qualcomm customers suffer, then Qualcomm suffers as well. By the way, Qualcomm generates, do you know how much of its revenues come from China?
I don't.
2/3.
Fuck off.
2/3 of its revenues are classed as China revenues.
God damn, 2/3.
22 billion last year are classed as China revenues. Now, it's a little bit misleading because what it means is it's the end destination of the shipment. So what you might have is Qualcomm shipping chips to a Samsung assembly plant in China for assembly into smartphones that then get sold to customers in Europe. Into Samsung phones. And then the chip...
I see. So it's not necessarily the Chinese market.
But companies headquartered in China, 40%.
Wow.
It's a huge amount of their
business.
I mean,
I know because I cover the smartphone numbers every quarter, and the Chinese market has disproportionate weight in the global smartphone market.
And it also has...
And Chinese vendors as well. Apart from Samsung and Apple, they're all fucking Chinese.
They're all Chinese these days. Yeah. It used to be a time when they were all Japanese, didn't there?
Yeah, you'd have Sony and LG.
Now they're all Chinese.
Actually, LG's Korean, but yeah.
They're all Chinese companies, and as you've just said, the Chinese market accounts for such a big deal. So 66% of their revenues are classed as China, and out of that, and 40% of their overall revenues are actually companies with headquarters in China, meaning people like Xiaomi and Vivo. So HiSilicon's recovery and Huawei's kind of resurgence, which could be quite dramatic this year, is really bad news, I think, for Qualcomm.
Right, good point. I mean, so, this comes back to what I was saying at the start, which is that America's trying to reconcile two diametrically opposite things, which is starve the Chinese of technological development while at the same time not hurting its own companies that do a fuck of a lot of business with the Chinese. Yeah. And so, just a couple of things. If it's all right, I'm just going to pivot back to my story. There's a couple of bits I want to read out. Yeah, back to my point about the channels of communication. I'm just gonna read myself, like my audiobook.
Did you do that?
No, I never. I should do. It just even if no one buys it, I should just have it there. So I said both Reuters and the FT received anonymous briefings that were clearly controlled leaks from the US Department of Commerce. Reuters cited no less than 3 anonymous sources identifying Intel and Qualcomm as having their Huawei export licenses revoked. Somehow a 4th source managed to elbow their way through the whispering throng to deliver the news that at least some of the moves had immediate effect. So that's me being slightly sceptical. I always think it's a bit arbitrary where they go, we got 3 people.
Yeah.
So, all right, 8, whatever.
I know.
Does that make it more? I
think multiple
legit?
Sources is okay.
Exactly. And then my skeptical tone continued, where I said, coincidentally, the FT received identical anonymous briefings, and it too got official confirmation that it had revoked, that the Department of Commerce had revoked something. So this is my point earlier. I think the Department of Commerce cherry picks, let's say, 5 to 10 broadsheets. Wall Street Journal, FT, Bloomberg, etc. New York Times probably had a go.
Yeah.
And I said in my second sentence of that paragraph, it's not obvious why the substance of this announcement, i.e. the fact naming Intel and Qualcomm specifically, needed to be imparted under the cloak of anonymity, but it does make the whole thing seem a bit more edgy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So there was that. And then just one other point I want to make from my own reporting, other than saying, I think this is really relevant. And in fact, it leads into the major point I wanted to make. So I talked about this MateBook X Pro Core Ultra being the catalyst for politicians throwing their toys out the pram about it. And then I, again, referring to the Reuters and the FT reporting, I said both reports conclude with extensive accounts of how bent out of shape US politicians were by the laptop launch. So much so that it took Senator Marco Rubio, a member of Congress Elise Stefanik, a mere 9 days to compose an indignant letter to Gina Raimondo, who's the Secretary of the Department of Commerce. And here's the bit which I think is so revealing. And I think increasingly, so we've been talking about whether or not the US has delivered enough evidence to justify the unilateral actions it's taking against especially Huawei.
Yeah.
And I'll say it again, I'm not a Huawei defender. They're not, they might buy me a drink every now and then, but there's no transactional relationship between me and Huawei. I just play each ball on its merits, and I just don't think the case against Huawei has been made strongly enough. And that's not to say that I don't find it all believable.
Yeah.
That Huawei, at the end of the day, if Xi Jinping clicks his fingers, they're going to have to do what they're told. I just think a lot of this stuff has been done without much evidence presented, at least to me.
I just think it's the arbitrariness of it that's odd. And I think these senators like Marco Rubio and the other one you mentioned, they seem to be a bit...
she's the key one, Elise Stefanik.
I get the feeling they're a little bit sort of... I mean, people will laugh at this maybe because you think this are politicians anyway, but like out of touch with what's going on in the real world.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a couple of stories where I've tracked US chip sales to China over the last few years to see what they are. Now, they dropped in 2022, they went up quite substantially, I think. I haven't got the story to hand now, and they went down last year, but they were still, I mean, as I say, Qualcomm is $22 billion dollars in sales to China. Now, they're not all Chinese companies, but a lot of them are Chinese companies, which is just discussed. Intel is selling huge quantities of semiconductors to Chinese companies.
No doubt.
Some of the other ones that were, I think Micron was kind of on a blacklist, wasn't it, for a while? Or it was sort of
their memory.
They sell memory chips. One of the things that I was really surprised about was the guys that do EDA, electronic design automation, isn't it?
Cadence,
software. Cadence and Synopsys, I think is the other one. Yeah. Their sales went up last year.
Yeah.
You'd think so these are the guys that you need apparently partly to do your chip processing. If you want to make really shit hot chips, you need certain things. You need ASML.
You can't just buy the kit off ASML. You've got to have all the clever software and stuff.
All sorts of other things as well. And Cadence and Synopsys, there's only like 3 of them. I think one of them's German now. I think one of them might be owned by, I might have this wrong. One's part of a German group, but the other two
sounds
are
like the
basically...
sort of thing they'd be good at.
The other two are American, and I think Cadence is one and Synopsys is the other. Their sales went up last year to China.
Well, sorry, carry on.
And it's just bizarre that they have this... it's just very incoherent, the whole policy. There's nothing very
It is.
sensible about it at all.
Well, and the only explanation for it is this, I think, futile attempt to reconcile.
But if Rebu was here now and you sat him down, then I showed him that table that I'd done. He's obviously not a reader of. I think he actually has read one or two light reading stories.
Yeah, he did. There was one where he retweeted it a few years ago.
But I don't think he's probably not someone who goes to the light reading website and keeps
not
up
his
with
first
everything. But I
port of
bet
call.
if we had him on and I put the table in front of him that showed what was going on, he'd be off writing a letter next week going, this is outrageous. That
It would
this is
take
going
him no
on."
more than 9 days to
It would
write a
take him
letter.
9 days to get another letter together saying, why are Cadence and Synopsys selling all this software
Quite.
still?
And so because America is not all in on this policy, and I don't necessarily endorse the policy, but I do have a slight shit or get off the pot view on it. If you're going to do it, then fucking do it properly.
Yeah.
What they've done, the Chinese have just gone, okay, we can see the direction of travel here. Sooner or later, where they're going to cut off all access to this stuff. But while they're granting these little licenses, let's just buy everything these fuckers can make and just stockpile it. And it's well known that they've been doing that for years.
Yeah. But
And why wouldn't they?
by the way, the guy who I spoke to this week, who is a bit of a chips expert, used to work in that industry. You know, he's now sort of more in the kind of observing it and commentating on it side of things. But he
We
was
like that side of things.
Yeah, he was quite sort of. You know, there's this view, I think, in some circles that China can never possibly catch up on chips. That's the way that America can really hurt them, because we're so far ahead, and what ASML's done is so wonderful that, I mean, ASML's not American, by the way, but I think it's had a lot of help from Intel and other companies that are American
and
to get together.
TSMC, it just develops so quickly. It's really hard to keep up with them. Even Intel has struggled.
Yeah, well, that's more on the manufacturing side, but in terms of the actual design stuff and all this, that China would really struggle to kind of catch up in that area. This is one of the views in the chip industry, or among some analysts who are perhaps quite hawkish on China. This guy that I spoke to was like, look, you know, this is a country of 1.4 billion people. You look what happened with Huawei, you know, where people were quite dismissive at first. You know, they're copycats. They just do cheap rip-off equipment.
Yeah.
What
may or may not have been true 20 years ago.
In 2017, 2018, everybody was saying, like, we speak to chief technology officers in the industry, everybody was saying their stuff's the best.
And their after-sales service was the best, and their credit terms were the best.
So I just think people underestimate the ability of a country like that to catch up within a few years and have something that rivals what the West does. And
I think there is a lot of complacency there. I've got, I'm just going to say one or two more things, and then I'm going to move it on to your Open RAN stuff, and I might get you to sort of slightly monologue it because I'm caught a bit short.
Okay.
So you might have to just tell Pierre the first couple of minutes of it while I go and answer the call of nature.
I might.
Or we could just have a cut off.
Let's just do an intermission.
We could do an intermission. Anyway, so I want to read out
ice cream and
so this. Yeah, exactly. Lovely fresh albatross. Do you know that Monty Python sketch? When they used to have cinemas back in the day, before your time, Pierre, in cinemas they used to have someone, typically a woman, would come down and they'd have a little tray.
I'm old enough that I've seen that. Yeah.
And then there's one Monty Python sketch where instead of selling ice creams and sweets, someone comes down and goes, albatross. You know, John Cleese doing that sort of slightly posh English.
It's just so
your lovely
surreal.
fresh albatross. And then, Michael
nuggets.
Palin or whatever goes, what flavour is it? He goes, what flavour is it? It's bloody seabird flavour, isn't it? Anyway, it's a funny sketch. How did we get onto that? Oh, yes.
That's complete surrealist humour, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Awful.
It's just
Brilliant. I mean, it's just great.
What flavor? It's awful.
Bloody seabird flavour. There's another similar sketch they did called Crunchy Frog. Remember that one? It was, boxes of chocolates like Milk Tray or Lindt boxes of chocolates where you got all different fillings and praline and coffee cream and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think this was Terry Jones was the owner of a chocolate company where they had just these really bizarre fillings, and one of them was Crunchy Frog. And then he was describing, a beautiful, lovely chocolate coating, and then a frog. And then again, you'd have John Cleese being indignant. Frog? People aren't expecting a bloody frog when they eat a chocolate.
Well, while we're on tangents and Monty Python, one thing I learned today was you're a Pink Floyd fan.
Yeah.
You know Dark Side of the Moon?
Yeah.
Do you know the connection between Dark Side of the Moon and Monty Python?
Not explicitly, no.
So apparently the profits from Dark Side of the Moon, which were massive because it's one of the biggest selling albums of all time, and that's the one that really transformed the band's fortunes. They all went up from bought country homes. But some of the profits went towards funding Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Really?
Yeah.
Didn't George Harrison also...
Because they were such big Monty Python fans that they put the money
George Harrison bankrolled Life of Brian.
Yeah, there was something...
Right, how weird. Rock bands basically were behind the 70s films that the Pythons did.
Yeah. In fact, I even linked to a bit of Python in the final segment, so put a pin in that one.
Right.
So let me finish this, and then I'll go. Then we'll have our little intermission where we have lovely fresh albatross. That was why we got onto that tangent, and then we'll get onto your bit. So yeah, this letter that Rubio and Stefanik sent to Congress after this laptop came out, I extracted one thing from it which I thought was so telling. So this is quoting from the letter: allowing cutting-edge American technology into Huawei's newest PC will only make it easier for the CCP to evade US technology restrictions and race ahead in AI. Your department's failure to enforce your own export control regime will aid the CCP and the PLA, so that's Chinese Communist Party and People's Liberation Army, as they seek to undermine America's prime position in the world. Now, that last bit, as they seek to undermine America's prime position in the world, I think is telling, because that's what's really is going on.
Yeah.
America is top dog on merit. I'm not taking anything away from it, but now it's feeling threatened, and it's trying to use dirty tricks.
Yeah.
Definitely not World Trade Organization legit techniques to try and keep the up-and-coming competitor.
He's shown all his cards there, hasn't he? Basically?
Totally. And so this is what I said. Let me read my final paragraph. I said, at least the US has finally stopped pretending this is about specific security concerns and is now openly admitting the tech Cold War is about subjugating China and ultimately the rest of the world in order to defend America's increasingly precarious dominance. And then there was one more quote that Stefanik gave Reuters explicitly in that article. She said, "This action will bolster US." This is in reference to the original story about them revoking these licenses. "This action will bolster US national security, protect American ingenuity, and diminish communist China's ability to advance its technology." So I just think they're saying the quiet part totally out loud now.
Yeah.
This isn't about security anymore. This is about geopolitical dominance in a technological field. And again, we've said loads of times on the pod before, I mean, I can understand why the Americans would want that. And I can also understand, like if our mate Strandy was here, he'd explain that there are all sorts of security reasons to keep China down because your average Chinese person barely spends a waking moment before plotting the demise of the West.
Yeah.
But I just think...
That's what they do on their lunch break.
Yeah. They grow a moustache just to twirl
solitaire.
it. Even if... And maybe they do. There's been all sorts of stories recently about them getting up to like cyber crime and all kinds of bollocks, and I'm sure they do. I don't doubt that. But I just think now this is no longer about anything specific. This is just about how, hold on, America's doing far too well. China's doing far too well by half technologically. We've got to try and put the genie back in the bottle, and I think it's ultimately futile.
Yeah. Don't you spend your lunch break plotting the downfall of China? I know I do.
No, I spent it plotting the downfall of light reading. Once light reading's gone, once we'll be the only telecoms website in the world. In fact, I'm going to say quickly one other thing before we go. I'm not going to get into this story, but
he's going to use that as a promo now.
Yeah.
I'll make a point of not doing that.
Yeah. I wrote another story about a week or so ago, said FCC moves to ban Huawei from certifying wireless kit. What next? And I'm just going to quickly mention that because it's slightly different, but it might be even more profound in the long term. The FCC, which is the American comms regulator, has got a system whereby companies can be involved in the certification of wireless kit, I don't know, routers or whatever. I'm not even sure why it has this system, but it's there. And they've just suddenly decided, hold on a sec, China's involved, Huawei's involved in that, we can't have that. So the first point is like, what have you only just fucking realised? So it feels like another of these things that's probably just come from fleeting political pressure. But the other one is, every time they kick them out of some certifying group, it makes me wonder whether they will ultimately try and kick them out of things like 3GPP.
Well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? That's where potentially could go.
Yeah. So this was just a thin end of the wedge thing by itself, but that's why I put what next in the headline.
And the thing that people downplaying this, who are in the equipment industry, the single interview I did with Ericsson's CEO, which is a few years ago now, he was worried about the possibility of that, about bifurcation of standards. So it's a
which will harm everyone.
A real threat.
That's the problem with these cold wars, is they harm everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's knock it on the head there. We'll have a quick break and then we'll get back onto your stuff. All right, here we are back. So we'll get into it because as Pierre just slightly moodily reminded us, we've been banging on for ages already.
No, it's just
That was a good.
I know.
to keep track of time.
I like winding up
It's
on
a
the
good
pod.
topic, though. I think.
No, it's
because it ties lots of other things in.
Well, exactly. I mean, the flip side is that the potential for meandering and tangents is almost limitless.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's get back onto it. You were going to talk last week, but because we meandered and tangented so much, we didn't get onto it. So you wrote a story, May the 2nd, Samsung, the Open RAN star, has not escaped the 5G winter.
Yeah.
And then you also wrote this week, which I don't know to what extent they directly overlap, another thing that is headlined Open RAN and its multi-vendor misfortunes. So why don't you start with the
I'm trying to
Samsung
get
one?
something in about that Doctor Strange film, the Multiverse of Madness.
Okay,
Something about
yeah.
multi-vendor madness, but
That
people are going multi-vendor madness. What does that mean? So it just ended up being misfortunes instead.
I see. All right,
Yeah.
well, good effort, mate.
Vicious, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
Really,
nothing ventured.
yeah.
So what was the Samsung one about? What was the essence
So
of
the
it?
Samsung one was, they came out with their results recently, and they were pretty good. I think the headline results.
But a lot of it was driven by like an uptick in memory chips or something.
Well, that's
like
what
that,
they are, though, isn't it? Smartphones and chips, really. That's
a lot of what they do. Yeah.
I mean, what else do they make their money from?
They do have. I mean, they're a massive conglomerate, so they do have other interests. But you're right. That's probably what
But the
dictates.
Samsung electronics bit itself.
Yeah.
is,
No, I'm sure you're
which is
right.
what we're talking about here. Is it's huge, isn't it? Basically, it's one of the biggest companies in the world.
It is.
But what they've started to do in the last couple of years, which they didn't used to do, is break out what they make in. They don't quite break it out. They have this unit called MX and networks. MX means devices.
Okay.
So that's the smartphone stuff, basically.
Yeah.
So most of MX and
MX, does that
I
stand
don't
for
know what
something?
MX stands for, but it is basically the
X
devices.
often means experience.
MX is basically the gadgets, like the
Okay.
smartphones. It's smartphones, I think, basically.
Multimedia experience. Fuck knows.
So MX and networks, most of the revenues for MX and networks, unsurprisingly, are MX. They're the devices.
Because Samsung smartphones are generally the biggest. Last year was the first year Apple sold more over a calendar year than Samsung.
So they don't show the networks. They don't have a networks line, but they do have an MX line. So what you can do is deduct the MX line from the networks and MX total to find out what the networks
There we go.
bit is.
And
Well, it's not very much, which is not surprising because networks is not like a massive market anyway. We're talking about by the way, when we say networks for Samsung, what they're mainly in really is 5G radio access networks.
Yeah, RAN.
And
Yeah,
that's kind of the big area anyway. They were so the first quarter of 2023. This is what we're talking about here because these are the results we're talking about.
2024?
2024. The revenues that they made from networks were 530 million, but they've gone down, interestingly, from 780 million.
Yeah, so that's a 31% decline.
Yeah. Are you in the story, are you?
Yeah.
So I wrote this a little while ago. Sometimes I can just sort of talk about these things like it's in my memory.
I can
but-
barely remember what I wrote this morning, mate.
Yeah, well, I can't remember this one that well. But anyway, this is obviously not good to go down by
31.
31%.
No one's saying 31% decline is good.
And it's obviously not a huge amount of money.
At least they're
anyway.
all at Samsung.
When you've got companies like Ericsson and Nokia making several billion each from this market.
So they're
And
still a fairly niche player.
they're a fairly niche player, and they don't show profits, but I would suspect that it's unprofitable. Is just my speculation because you'd have to spend quite a lot on R&D. I mean, this is one of my issues actually with Open RAN and the idea that you can have a more sort of diverse and competitive radio access network market is that for companies to be able to compete against the majors, by which I mean Huawei and Ericsson and Nokia, you have to be spending a considerable amount
Yeah.
of money just on research and development.
Well, I mean, that's one thing. For all those times we've spoken about Ericsson and Nokia cutting costs, they're always really careful not to cut R&D spend if they
Yeah.
possibly can.
Exactly. Well, I think actually Nokia has cut
Right.
R&D spend. I mean, they might not have done in the first quarter, but their trajectory, if you look back to sort of 2016 or whatever, when they merged with Alcatel-Lucent, doesn't look that positive. It's like overall R&D spending
Right.
it's been flattish or it's gone down. Whereas Ericsson has kind of stuck to its policy of kind of investing more in that area. I think they feel they learnt the lesson well under Hans Vestberg, who basically, fucked it up for them, essentially. I think it's fair to say. And they don't want to go down that road again. But see, I was at a conference called Fuse last year
Yeah.
in Madrid, which was organised by TIP, and there was a guy there from AT&T called Robert Sonny, who's on the RAN side, and his estimate was that that was that Ericsson and Nokia together were probably spending about 5 billion in research and development on radio access network technology. I think their combined budget last year is about 9.3 billion, because obviously Nokia's got other activities that we should account for a lot of that, and Ericsson does a few other bits and pieces as well to do with things like Vonage and software stuff for the 5G core. But that 5 billion, so if you kind of think that's two companies, to be competitive then you need to be spending probably about 2.5 billion a year. I mean, that's almost all of Samsung's network revenues for the whole of 2023. I think it earned about 2.7 billion in 2023. So if they were spending a similar amount, they're only left with 200 million, yeah? And then they've got, this is just R&D we're talking about here. Doesn't factor in anything to do with production, marketing, all the other cost items that you might have. So I suspect it's probably not making money, is my... Now, we don't know that. I mean, this is all pure speculation. I don't know they're spending 2.5 billion. I'm just saying that...
If I'm going to go with anyone's speculation in, I'll go with yours.
Yeah. But the thing that's interesting is what this tells you is how hard it must be for anybody else.
Yeah.
Because Samsung, at least they can run this, if they want to, they can run it at a loss and have...
If they think it's worth it in the long term.
If they think it's worth it in the long term, because the whole group as a whole is obviously massive. This is a tiny bit of what the group does. There are probably some, I hate the word, but there are probably some synergies they can realise with what they're doing in chip technologies in other areas. And... they can run it at a loss and try and establish themselves in this market.
Well, and I think the other thing, and you strongly allude to this in your headline, Open RAN is almost designed as an opportunity to open the door, and that's not where the open comes from, but it might as well.
Yeah.
To open the door to anyone to break what is now effectively in the West a duopoly of Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah.
And so Samsung, which, as we've just discussed, have the resources to do it, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get into a market. And not everyone can do it. We've spoken in the past about more niche players that have had a rocky time of it, like Parallel and that sort of thing. And I think like Mavenir's gone quite all in, but I don't think they found it plain sailing either.
I just think these guys like Parallel and Mavenir, you're talking about an order of magnitude difference between them and Samsung. In terms of
the only reason I bring them up is, the door is open to all of them. Yeah. And not only is the likes of Parallel struggling, but even Samsung, which I think is part of the point you're making.
It is. Yeah. But I'm fair, despite my headline and the problems. I mean, the problems they've got, to be honest with you, a lot of it, this decline, is tied to the kind of bleak situation that we find the radio access network market in at the moment. Operators aren't spending money. You had a big build-up of inventory in North America, which is probably the most profitable market in the world for these guys, for Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. It's where they make their money, really, in radio access network stuff. It's not in Europe. It's not, certainly not in Africa. It's in North America.
Yeah, and we've spoken loads of times before. Yeah. I mean, you wrote a great story about how America basically underwrites 5G R&D for everyone.
Totally.
Because they pay such a premium.
Yeah, they effectively subsidise Europe, and what's happened there is they this is what we're told by people like Ericsson, Nokia, is that they built up so much inventory after the COVID situation and the kind of supply chain nightmare that was going on after that they're still running that down. They're they're
Which
still
is
kind
why
of,
we're having one of the reasons
Yeah.
we got the telecoms recession that we got
yeah,
now.
they've still got their kind of cupboards like fully stocked, and they don't have to go back to the shop to sort of stock up again, basically. And
Yeah.
the shopkeepers are waiting
It's
for them
like
to do
people
it.
with bog roll after the pandemic.
It is. Yeah, they've got loads of bog roll.
People still getting through
And
their Costco bog roll now.
It's exactly the same. So the bog roll owners.
That's your next headline.
The bog roll owners are sitting there waiting.
5G is
for
like bog roll.
This inventory to be run down, and probably trying to sell laxatives on the side or something. And and until I think there's a bit more optimism now that maybe it's going to happen later this year. But the problem is, even outside North America and including North America, there's not a huge appetite for investment in 5G in the RAN because, we talk about this all the time on the pod, that the 5G network hasn't led to any revenue growth for operators. It's not been transformative in the way that people were hoping. It's not had that. It's not had that sort of catalyzing effect on sales growth that people were hoping. It's not really done anything in enterprise markets yet. So people don't want to spend money, and as a result of that, the market's shrinking. So our own sister company, Omdia, last year revenues went down 11%. Apparently, it's quite a big drop, 11% for the whole market in terms of RAN spending.
Okay, so you're saying Omdia reports that the RAN revenues went down. I thought for a sec you were going Omdia revenues went down.
No,
It's
not
like,
Omdia.
Yeah, should you really be saying this on the fucking pod?
Omdia's figures for the
Omdia's
RAN
doing great.
market are down. It's down 11% last year. So it's around about the figures around about the 40 billion mark for RAN spending each year. I think it goes up and down a bit, but let's say it's about that. But it went down 11% last year. This year, the forecast is 4 to 6% by Omdia. I think Deloro, which is the other big company in that space, is saying
And that's the one that
4%.
Ericsson uses for its projections.
Ericsson uses that for its projections, but the interesting thing is when they talked about their projections on the last earnings call and they went, Deloro's saying 4% decline, Boy Echo went, I think that's a bit optimistic.
Yeah.
which I think I use as my headline.
And
even,
I can't remember other quarterlies I've seen. It might not be from either Nokia or Ericsson. Maybe it was Nokia's. But there's some people, how both of them were spinning out the narrative of things will get better in the second half of the year.
Yeah.
I've seen other people talking. I can't remember. In quarterly season, there's so much stuff flying around. Them going, I wouldn't even fucking hold your breath about that if I were you.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to pick up till 2025.
2025, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Samsung's problems at the moment are obviously tied to the macroeconomic situation. I think they've got a few other things that are going on that haven't been that encouraging for them. So the AT&T deal with Ericsson in North America, we're talking about the most profitable market here of North America. There's only 3 big operators, right? They're already in with Verizon. They've very publicly got this big deal at Nokia's expense a few years ago. Maybe there's an opportunity to do something with T-Mobile, which uses, as far as I understand it, Ericsson and Nokia 50-50 more or less at the moment. I mean, that's obviously, if that happens, that's going to come at the expense of either Ericsson or Nokia.
Indeed.
If it comes at the expense of Nokia, that is a disaster for Nokia, by the way. That would mean them having lost business with all 3 big US companies in the space of 5 years. And it's potentially catastrophic, I would go as far as saying, if they did lose business with T-Mobile. I mean, they really need to make sure that doesn't happen.
They need to get some kind of special card in Vegas.
In fact, this has given me an idea for a story headline.
Take loads of execs to Vegas constantly.
Yeah, which is Nokia's big job at the moment is to defend that T-Mobile contract.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing for their mobile business group to do, really, I think. But let's say that you look at AT&T, which is the other one. Is there an opportunity for Samsung with AT&T? No, there isn't. Why isn't there? Because last December, AT&T did a massive $14 billion deal with Ericsson for this rollout of Ericsson kit and software across the 1/3 of the footprint that Ericsson wasn't already supplying to AT&T, which is covered by Nokia. So this is why Nokia has now sort of lost business with not only one big carrier, the thing that happened with Verizon a few years ago, but 2 of them. But even though it's pitched as an Open RAN deal, which you would think, well, there's an opportunity, and then isn't there for other players to come in and sort of, mix and match with Ericsson and play in that kind of that sphere. I don't see it happening. And the reason I don't see it happening is because this gets onto the Open RAN thing I wrote this week to a certain extent. But even Ericsson itself is presenting that very much as we do the software. we did a horizontal layer that I think is, you're at the event that I was at in the build up to MWC, where they were talking about how they're sort of seeing their business evolve. Instead of winning a particular geographical area, you need to play in certain layers of the network and be very strong in one of those layers as a kind of horizontal platform. What seems to have happened with AT&T is that they're the only company in the mix to do the DU and CU software, so the baseband software that would connect to your radios, the only provider that is named in that deal, and that is, as far as I can see, likely to remain in that deal, in that area, is Ericsson. Same goes for service and management orchestration. It's only Ericsson. So the only real opportunity for someone like Samsung to come along and sell kit to AT&T, as I see it, is on the radio unit side. Actually doing some hardware, which is the kind of thing that Fujitsu is down to provide. They're one of the companies that were named in the deal.
Okay.
They were already an Ericsson partner. They've had a 5G partnership with Ericsson since about 2019, I think, 2018, 2019. And I think if you talk to AT&T or Ericsson, they would say, well, there might be more radio unit vendors who could come along in the future potentially and, sell equipment. The problem, as I see it, is I don't see those deals happening between tier one companies. This idea that you could get a network where Ericsson does the baseband software and Nokia does the radios, I just don't think it's ever going to happen. It's always going to be a tier one company with a smaller vendor or two smaller vendors in those arrangements.
Right.
Because I just don't think the level of integration, systems integration and effort and collaboration that goes on in those arrangements is it's all so involved. I just don't see it happening at a big company level.
I see.
I think an Ericsson or a Nokia would immediately worry, and this is a massive issue when it comes to massive MIMO. It's an even bigger concern.
Why is that?
It's an even bigger. It's such a complex technology that there needs to be a really close alignment between what's going on in the radio side, the radio unit side, and what's going on in the baseband side. To the extent, so I've been told this by fairly senior people, that you actually need to align your software essentially.
Okay, so this is about who you want to expose yourself to that much in a business sense.
This is who you're going to... So Open RAN's all about mixing and matching vendors, yeah?
Yeah.
And I only see those mixing and matchings happening between a big vendor like Ericsson with a smaller vendor, say Mavenir.
Yeah.
Or between smaller vendors, so Mavenir and Rakuten, let's say. I would never ever see it happening between Ericsson and Nokia, because I think they'd just be far too concerned about
there's all sorts of
state secrets kind of thing.
Exactly.
It's like the idea of Coca-Cola teaming up with Pepsi, and sharing their recipes to produce
super cola.
To produce some super cola, and we'll adapt our recipe a bit, and you adapt your recipe a bit, and we'll come up with a new recipe. It's a similar thing. I just don't, and I actually don't think it's in the industry's interests anyway. Why would they want the two companies that account for most market share outside China? Why would you want a collaboration involving those two? It doesn't advance the cause of Open RAN. It doesn't advance the cause of diversity if you're just getting an Ericsson and a Nokia. So I don't think the operators would want it. I don't think it's in the vendors' interests. And that's the reason I don't see Samsung really being an option for a partnership with AT&T, because even though it's not in the same ballpark as Ericsson and Nokia in terms of how much it makes from radio access network products, it's very much seen as being the other option, isn't it? It's very much the number three in the game now that we don't have Huawei and ZTE. I mean, certainly in North America, where it's got this big deal with Verizon. So I think to square the circle kind of thing.
In fact, we're going to have to, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I just don't see AT&T being a big opportunity for them.
So and so more broadly, the total available market for Samsung may be smaller than we might have assumed.
So just to very speedily race through the rest of it, I would say the other problem they've got is India, where they've lost market share clearly, because they used to be the sole provider to Reliance Jio, which is the biggest operator in India. They did all the 4G stuff for them.
And they've been spending like crazy.
And they've been spending what Jio's done with 5G is not to just use Samsung. They've introduced Ericsson and Nokia alongside Samsung. So they've automatically lost market share there, which has not been a good thing for them. Although probably made some decent money out of that 5G build out. And they have had work with Airtel as well, as I understand it. The real opportunity, I think, for Samsung is in Europe. And the big opportunity in Europe is this supposedly 170,000, I mean, that covers Africa as well, but this 170,000 site tender that Vodafone's issued this year, which is talked about 4 years, by the way,
Yeah.
since 2019, but it's actually gone ahead this year. This
Okay.
is in process at the moment. Vodafone loves Samsung. They think they're well into Open RAN. They love everything Open RAN. They're big sort of champion cheerleaders for Open RAN, to use that word that we sort of associate with Daniel Royston. They're like that for Open RAN. They're the
They love
European
it.
they're the European cheerleaders for Open RAN, I would say.
So, Vodafone,
And-
yeah,
Vodafone,
definitely.
and
I agree with
they
that.
clearly have moved ahead quite aggressively with Samsung in terms of what they're doing in the UK, also in Romania. I think that that tender, if anybody's going to come out of that well and pick up quite a bit of work, it's going to be Samsung. What they'll do is they'll apply that template that they've already used in the UK, where they're using
Yeah.
Samsung as the main provider, but mixed in with sort of general purpose equipment from Intel and Dell and this
so
sort of
on.
thing. And that's what they'll do across that tender.
Okay.
In areas where potentially they need to swap Huawei, I think.
Cool. Well, I'm sure he won't give anything away, but one of the reasons I'm hurrying it along is I just got a message from Jamie Davis to say he's in the pub waiting for us.
Is he?
Yeah.
But he's very early.
He's very early. So we don't want to keep him waiting, and we can go, all right, Jamie, how's it going? So how much of the Vodafone tender is going to go to Samsung?
Wait, yeah, it's quite interesting that Jamie's waiting for us. You can ask him now.
Yeah. And I don't want to get Jamie in the shit. I'm sure we'll just talk about,
Yeah.
sport and
Yeah.
what we've been up to and all that sort of thing. He's got a young family, so he doesn't get that many opportunities to come out. So I don't want to keep him waiting too long.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get onto the final quick segment, which we'll do within 15 minutes. I wrote a headline this morning called "Apple hilariously pulls new iPad ad because of internet moans." And my subhead was US gadget giant Apple used a clumsy and aesthetically jarring metaphor in a video ad for its new iPad, then cancelled it as soon as a few people objected. Now, what I thought might be fun to do, I don't know what good radio this is going to make, Pierre, but I thought what might be fun is to get Ian, because I don't think he's seen the video. So what I did is I embedded a Tim Cook tweet. Yeah, I think. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's
I'm
the
just
one that
showing
you're
it
just
there.
showing.
Okay.
Okay, well, I can show it on my laptop, wherever you prefer. But what I wanted to do, just
It's a nice
just
looking
stop it.
electric
Or just stop
piano.
it.
That looks like the piano I've got in my
Let me
house.
just cue it up. Just fucking jump the gun, mate.
That's right.
What I want Ian to do, and you can do it. We can do it from your laptop or mine, Pierre. I'm not bothered. But I just wanted Ian to watch it and just give a live commentary because you haven't
Okay.
seen it before.
Yeah.
Should I do it on mine because I can just swivel it around? And,
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll make it.
I actually haven't seen it either,
Oh, you haven't seen it either.
but I've read the concept of it, and it is kind of
Okay.
dumb.
So let's go back to the beginning.
Can you make an Alan Partridge commentary?
Well,
Yeah.
Wow.
So I'll do it. So Pierre, you if you haven't seen it either, then you muck in as well. I have because I wrote about it.
Right.
Shall I put the volume up just
Yeah.
to see if it will come
will
over?
it cause?
Fine, leave it there.
All right. Okay. All right. Here we go.
Okay, there's a metronome going. There's an old school record player of the sort I remember of the 70s and 80s, and a load of recording equipment
Everything
on
that they used
screen.
to
Oh, the
make it.
trumpets just appeared.
And what's
And,
what-
and there's some kind of thing coming down from the ceiling. It's like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom where they all get squashed. There's a piano that's about to end up in a very bad way. And yeah, there's paint now pour. For some reason, there's paint on top of the piano. It's because it's colour. And I guess I get the analogy. The metronome's just got buggered up. Some plaster cast of Beethoven's gone bad. And basically all the electronic equipment is now exploding as this ceiling lowers. Guitar, books. This is terrible, Scott.
some little smiley
some
face,
smiley face
mashed
guy.
up.
Yeah.
And then how does it conclude?
I think it's a little bit.
Now the ceiling is lifting, and
it
in its
reveals-
place is a beautiful new iPad
No,
Pro.
I think I understood what they tried to do.
Yeah, go ahead.
But
No, go ahead. Say what you think they're trying to do.
I think they're trying to be like, look, we could cram. This can do a lot of things.
Yeah.
And it's like a lot of things crammed into one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I get it. But to show the actual destruction
I completely
of
agree.
these beautiful instruments, that's bad because it's like a book. You don't destroy.
I
But
completely agree.
and
It's like Nazi book burnings.
Pretty much,
Had there
like
been like
Fahrenheit,
fake,
whatever.
had there been like fake foam instruments and they get squashed, cute, like
Yeah, yeah.
funny, that would have been fine. But I see what.
So it's like
yeah.
I use the term aesthetically jarring. Seeing these beautiful instruments and books and
It's just
and
badly
stuff like that getting mashed up is aesthetically jarring. What do you think? What do you take from that ad?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously what they're trying to do. What Pierre just said basically explains it well. Like, you're condensing all this brilliant creativity into this single device, and you get the color and the sound and the history of music that you associate with Beethoven and Mozart. But
All in this really thin device.
I mean, I'd read the news stories this morning without seeing the advert, and everybody seemed to be like really offended by it. It's almost like there was some kind of racism in it, or
no. It's dumb, but it's not that.
No, but I agree. I
but
think
the reaction to it wasn't.
what Ian's
that
inferring
nature.
is like the pitch of the offence was as if they'd done something worse than they actually did.
I mean, Christ, people do stunt car adverts all the time where they like the movies are all about sort of crashing vehicles and wrecking stuff, and nobody makes a fuss about you driving a new BMW off a bridge, and
the presumption that also that these instruments, like the iPad stuff, would sound as good as the real deal. That's also like, 'cause for somebody who plays with like music on like digitally, it's like it's never as good as the real stuff.
Yeah, of course.
It doesn't. Even come
So you're
close.
right. So there's a certain conceit and presumption
Yeah.
that goes, you don't even need this Stradivarius violin. You got a fucking iPad.
I'm like, yeah. That sounds like a shit MIDI file. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I take all those points. So I thought it was fascinating, and I said. So my opening main paragraph was, Apple has long been obsessed with the thinness of its products for some reason, and apparently managed to shave a fraction of a millimetre from the girth of its latest one. Some bright spark in its in-house marketing department decided to illustrate this concept through the metaphor of an industrial press crushing various analog creative tools into a wafer. You can see what they're trying to do to indicate that all that cool stuff is now contained within this single really thin device.
You know what they should do for the Apple Vision Pro 2? They should show like a whole house, a whole living room being crushed, everything you own, and you can just live in a shack wearing the Vision Pro.
So this is it. I mean, I'm going to read a lot of my stuff, not because I'm trying to blow smoke up my own arse, just because it articulates it as well as I would off the cuff, or better than I would off the cuff now. So then I went to say, the main aesthetic problem with the ad is it seems to take protracted relish in the crushing of things like musical instruments, games machines, and even books. It might have been possible to give Apple the benefit of the doubt and say the metaphor was about compressing all those cool things into one device if the ad wasn't bafflingly named Crush ! Which it is.
Oh, okay. That's
by Apple itself.
Yeah.
So the whole thing, if you click through, I've got a hyperlink to the YouTube. The whole ad is called Crush! I mean, that's it. So anyway, and then I made the point. I said the additional problem is the metaphor could instead be interpreted as Apple crushing creative people by forcing them onto its platforms, and thus extracting rent from their labour through its dominance of the digital domain.
That's the problem. Is I think actually is the way
crushing the competition.
But crushing the world. I mean, I think I edited it when I was on the train, and I threw in a few little. I said rapaciously attracting rent, because Apple charges a 30% tax on every sale that happens through its stores.
I actually don't have a problem with it, because for that very reason, I think it's an incredibly good metaphor for the way that big tech is and the way that Apple is. I
don't think that's what Apple
I don't
intended.
think that's what they intended, but I think it's actually a brilliant illustration of all the negative things about these giant American
Amazon
companies.
should have a version where they crush like small businesses.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the baker guy, like
and then they crush freedom of speech and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and it's the machine is the Moneytron.
Well, so that's the most amazing thing about it. Yeah, the money, the profit amassing.
that's the one that you got into trouble for.
Yeah. Well, I think Amazon.
Someone from Amazon got in touch with you and said you're taking a piss out of our Moneytron.
Called the Dominatotron or something like that. Terminator.
It is called Moneytron, isn't it?
No, that's his invented name for it.
That's me being hyperbolic.
No,
Okay, sorry.
it's got made up the Moneytron. It was something else.
It's got TM.
But it wasn't a million miles off.
Yeah.
It sounded dystopian.
Do you know the one that you've come up with that's particularly popular at the moment in LinkedIn circles is the less shit.
Yes,
the less shit.
Dean
button.
Bubbly shared it. So this is a funny little quick tangent to go off on. So Dean Bubbly recently this week, there was a bit of news that I think we were going to cover last week, but again ran out of time. AT&T came out with a feature called like Turbo,
Yeah.
where basically you can request something and pay extra for a sort of premium communication
It's this whole
service.
same thing about APIs and quality of service.
Exactly,
and
it's all that stuff.
Yeah.
And Dean Bubley's been on the pod several times and gave us a shout out because he was writing. He's very active on LinkedIn, isn't he?
Yeah.
And on Twitter for that matter.
Yeah.
And he said, Scott and Ian have got a good phrase for this from their podcast.
I think it's yours. It's not mine.
Well, thank you. I can't remember. Where they call it the less shit button. In fact, that does sound a bit more like me, doesn't it?
It's more you than me.
Because they're basically saying you can pay some more and then our service will be a bit less shit.
For a few minutes, and then it'll go back
until
to
you
shit.
stop paying, and then it'll go back to shit again.
Yeah, Mike Deno had the same take on this.
Right.
In March.
Did he?
Yeah, he was talking about Cox in the US. They dropped they had the throttling thing, like E, and they after a few months they just dropped it because he was like, yeah, does that mean like the rest of the time is just not very good?
Quite.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is where I might have come up with the obscene reference that Dean quoted, but it was derived from Ian's observation. Was like, why do you need a premium button if your service is so fucking good to start with?
Note to self: next time I'm on the call with Frederick Yedling or someone from Ericsson, I'm going to say this QoS thing. Does that mean the rest of the time it's not good quality?
Well, quite.
I just see what they say because
What's the opposite of QoS? SOS, shittiness of service. Anyway, so getting back, and we're going to wrap up in a minute.
yeah.
So as I think Pierre just pointed out a minute ago, or maybe it was you when you were watching the news and you thought the reaction was a bit overdone. I thought so.
Yeah.
I think we all agree it's a slightly misguided ad and the aesthetics of it are jarring. But anyway, here's like The Verge wrote, Apple doesn't understand why you use technology, which isn't that bad, but it's a bit sort of haughty. And then Engadget.
They're nothing if not haughty, The Verge.
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, all these yank tech sites are a bit
Yeah.
up their own arse, as far as I'm concerned.
The Verge knows best, and you don't.
Yeah, quite. There's something very supercilious about all of them.
Oh, one of the guys that I just walked past him at Mobile Congress. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Oh, no worries. Did you fanboy him?
No, I was like, hey, he's
That's
got a
that
weird
geezer.
name. Like a German name.
Oh, that is weird.
Yeah.
I don't want to
know.
talk about it anymore
Yeah.
if it's German.
No, we don't want
He's
to talk
one of
about
the main.
Germans.
He's one of the main journalists. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Dieter or something.
Oh,
I wanna
yeah.
say it's Dieter.
Yeah. Well, you get a surprising number of proper German names in. I think people underestimate the amount of German immigration to the States. It's got a really big.
Dieter Born. That's
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Basically,
Very
everybody
German
lives in
name.
Punxsutawney and places like that. They're all German.
Oh, he's not at the Verge anymore. Sorry.
Okay.
Moving on.
And then another yank tech site, Engadget, wrote its headline was Apple apologizes for its tone deaf ad. They love to use words like tone deaf, which basically means doesn't agree with me.
But I think that's it. Yeah.
That crushed human creativity to make an iPad, which I thought, while hyperbolic, made me laugh. Because, they're taking our observations and taking it a few steps further down the line, aren't they? And then the best one was quite a short headline. This, again, reminds me of Spinal Tap. There was a bit in Spinal Tap when they were going through reviews of their albums. And they were going... And it was the director reading out the reviews. He goes that the review for your album Shark Sandwich was just a 2-word review, shit sandwich. And they were like, they can't say that, can they? Anyway,
But okay, to defend, the whole like digital versus real, like in my own experience, I dabbed with like a digital piano keyboard for a while before I bought an actual keyboard, and now I wonder like maybe the digital one got me into it enough that then I bought a real keyboard. So then maybe.
oh yeah, I mean I've played around on
this.
GarageBand. I think it's an amazing bit of software. Especially as it's free.
Yeah.
I think the issue is just. I think you said it well earlier, Pierre. It's just a presumption of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of brilliant tools there, but because, and Apple in a marketing sense is, again, it's almost as cliched as me saying I'm a free market, like small government liberal type of person. Another cliche of mine is to say I haven't got it in for Yanks because I spend quite a lot of time on the pod having a go at Americans for various things. But it's nothing personal. It's just that we're all very exposed to American culture, American politics and all that sort of thing. And, I don't think it's just me that says that they're inclined to be the most hyperbolic and extreme in their marketing. They're more inclined to overstate.
I think they just thought the ad agency was like, this will look cool. Let's just do that. You know, it's a visual.
Yeah,
they didn't think of
they
the
would just be more
consequences.
hyperbolic. They would just say this is the greatest thing in the world ever,
Like,
in
why
a
is there
way that
paint
Europeans probably wouldn't.
Why is there paint buckets on top of the piano? You know.
Yeah,
It's just.
and when it lands, it's amazing because it blows you away. And a lot of Apple marketing over the years has been amazing, especially when Steve Jobs was there. It was just like, you know, there was something magical about their stuff. Whereas this one just missed the mark. Anyway, I loved the final American tech site that I quoted was TechCrunch, appropriately enough. Should be called Tech Crush in this context. And their headline was simply, Apple's crush ad is disgusting.
No.
Exactly. So I think they're getting a bit carried away there.
I want to see a spoof one where it's like an Amazon warehouse floating like Independence Day, you know, and just lands and crushes a whole neighborhood.
Well, I mean, so that was the most tone deaf to appropriate one of their terms. Parts of it is, and I think even like Daring Fireball, who's a guy who's very pro Apple, who's been writing about them for decades, said, "Yeah, Apple, you're the man now. You're not the upstart that maybe you were when the iPhone first came out. You're the man now, and you should adapt your voice accordingly. So anything that seems too triumphalist, everything that seems too much like we're the fucking best, is going to land differently for the Apple of 2024 than it would of the Apple 20 years ago."
Yeah, they should market the iPad as like a stepping, like a tool to achieve those great
Well,
things.
some people said that a really cool version of the ad would have been it in reverse. Would have been all those musical intervals coming out of the iPad.
That's so brilliant.
Yeah, but you can imagine what went on. They were obsessed with this thinness. The problem was they were distracted by the thinness, and so they had to have it being crushed because then the resulting thing would be incredibly thin. If they weren't distracted by the thinness, then they could have had all the violins and the books and the fucking computer games coming out of the iPad. But I think thinness, that for some reason they're obsessed with thinness.
Or they could have shown like the press from
They're
above.
like a supermodel.
They like show the press from above, so you don't see what's being crushed, and then they show the side view where in reverse. I don't know.
So, and then some guy called Tor Myron, sounds Scandinavian, but he's their VP of Marcoms, gave an exclusive quote to a site called Ad Age, which is about the advertising industry rather than tech. And I won't read it out, it's very generic, but he was just groveling. And he goes, in fact, I'll give you the final couple of sentences. "We missed the mark with this video and we're sorry." And then they were going to buy loads of TV ad slots, as I'm sure you can imagine, and they just canned the whole fucking above the line campaign. Anyway, and then here's the Monty Python reference I made. I wonder if I can get this on the mic.
Monty Python's come up a lot on this pod.
It has come up a lot. I said, well, it's understandable for Apple to bravely run away in the face of this feedback, and then I linked to this bit. Let's turn the volume right up.
He buggered off. So he has his scarping.
Praise the Robin ran away.
No.
Bravely ran away.
I didn't.
When danger in its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail. Yet brave Sir Robin turned about.
I didn't.
He chickened out. Bravely take.
I never did.
He's a very brave retreat.
Oh, lie.
Bravest of the brave.
I never.
Anyway,
I remember that.
That's from the
I
Holy
haven't watched
Grail.
that film for quite a long time.
That's from the Holy Grail, and the whole point of Sir Robin is he's incredibly brave, and he just shits himself every time anything happens.
The Holy Grail, which we now know was sponsored by Led Zeppelin,
Zeppelin and Pink Floyd.
and then another couple.
I mean, you'll be telling me like Jimi Hendrix and fucking Aerosmith got
It's
involved.
so
doesn't it?
bizarre that the rock bands basically bankrolled Monty Python in the 70s.
Deep
Apparently, John
Purple.
Cleese said we turned to them because we knew they had money.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, they were obviously, I mean, not obviously, they were presumably just moved in similar circles with them, and they were able to have a little chat when they were all on the lash.
I mean, what they did was kind of rock and roll as well.
Yeah, in a comedy way, incredibly so, I think. Yeah. So anyway, so I said, well, it's understandable for Apple to bravely run away, and then hyperlink to that Holy Grail bit. In the face of this feedback, it's hilarious that apparently nobody at the company flagged up this potential objection at any stage before the ad was inflicted on the unsuspecting public. Did nobody in one of the world's most dominant companies question whether leaning into the concept of crushing in its literal rather than slang sense? So to give them some credit, they were probably trying to say the slang sense, you know, this is a bit younger generation than me, is like he's crushing it, implies that he's like kicking ass, he's doing really well. But the concept of crushing, so maybe they just got blinkered about the slang sense rather than the literal sense, was a great idea. And then my final paragraph, and then, I'll give Ian and Pierre a chance to speak, and then we'll call it a day. I said, Schadenfreude aside, so I use German words when it suits me.
Yeah.
It's nice to see...
Well, you only use that one. To be honest.
That's true. It's nice to see that even the most apparently imperious companies are just as susceptible to screwing up as the rest of us. Of course, Apple could have just ridden out the ephemeral internet drama. And, that's another criticism I have. They could have just gone, yeah, well, you can see what we're trying to do. Just fucking calm down.
Yeah.
But it seems to lack the capacity for nuanced interaction with the communications ecosystem. And my point there is, I think Apple doesn't have the channels to explain itself. When it gets a backlash like this, if it was more plugged in, if it was chatting to people like you, not that we'd be top of their list, far from it, but maybe if it was chatting to people like Engadget and TechCrunch and The Verge more, it could have gone, all right, yeah, I hear you. It can seem like that, but just bear this in mind in your reporting. This is back to the chat with Howard, having the behind the scenes briefings where you go, well, I'd be grateful if in your reporting you would give our perspective, which is we were just trying to say it's about compressing all these incredible creative tools into this one tiny little thin thing.
Yeah.
It probably would have been futile because these people have got on their high horse by that stage.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so I said it could, yeah. And so I said if its attempt at slick above the line marketing fails, there's no plan B. And then I finished off with a little dig at Apple, but it was wholehearted. I said, Apple has a famously muted, capricious and vindictive approach to PR, but there's little hope this experience will change that. And my point is, though, they don't engage. You're basically on Team Apple, you can fuck off.
What's the upshot of all this? Are they withdrawing this advert?
Yeah.
They are? Okay. I mean, I find it's a bit weird, really, because people normally get worked up these days about things that are perceived to be a slight to like ethnic groups or people of a certain sexual predisposition
or some protected group or other.
Exactly. And you've said the wrong thing. You've said something politically incorrect in an advert, or you've shown something
which I'd be amazed if Apple ever did.
Or you've done a Christmas advert that you filmed like weeks before the Israel invasion of Gaza that appears to show a Palestinian flag burning or something. That was
an Israeli one.
That was
depending
one I remember.
on which group
which
you're
is
in.
Completely ridiculous. But whereas this just seems like direct feedback on an ad that
was a bit
just
shit.
Didn't like, basically.
Yeah, and it did miss the mark.
Missed the mark. So it's not. Yeah, it's not. I mean, they're not done anything offensive, I don't think, really,
no.
in the way that the word.
Unless you can be really purist about musical instruments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like seeing musical instruments bashed up, obviously, but it's like I was just saying, you get all sorts of manner of destruction in Hollywood movies of everything from
exactly.
cars to expensive sailing yachts to homes to whatever it might be, and some of that's digitally generated these days, but some of it isn't. Some of it's actually they really do it. So
it's quite selective outrage.
It's quite selective outrage. It's a bit odd, but it was just the thing I find a bit odd about it is that you would have thought a company like Apple would test this stuff on.
I know. Well,
this is the weird thing. They go and test this stuff in consumer groups. How does this go? Yeah, exactly. To the point where nobody seems to like it, and Hugh Grant and everybody's off on.
Oh well, I put a Hugh Grant tweet in there. So Hugh Grant, at the bottom of it, there's a tweet from Hugh Grant saying the destruction of the human experience, which is a bit hyperbolic, courtesy of Silicon Valley. And then there was another tweet from someone called Snazzy Labs going, rule number 1, you do not apologise to Hugh Grant ever.
Do you know what's funny about people like Hugh Grant and Apple and the kind of where the alignment between is like Apple and its sort of political inclinations and the things that it likes to sort of shout about and feel that it's on the right side of would probably be very, very aligned with Hugh Grant's, I suspect, as a lovey.
Yeah.
And yet you get this kind of tension on the fact that he doesn't like big
but
companies.
This is typical of the, we were going back to the students earlier. This is typical of the virtue signalling type. There's a phrase that Americans use called purity spiral.
Yeah.
And they will always end up turning on each other because the purity spiral gets narrower and narrower, and the parameters of purity get narrower and narrower. And if you fall outside it, then you're a heretic or an apostate.
Yeah.
It's just fucking bollocks.
I mean,
Complete waste
I have
of
a
time.
problem with big corporations trying to be right on.
Yeah, well, I don't
know,
believe
and,
it's possible for a corporation to have any moral position
Exactly,
at all.
I totally agree with you. And all this green stuff and everything, and ESG, I think is
It's just superficial
is very
posturing.
superficial posturing, and it's just obviously designed to make them out to
Curry
be
cheap, superficial favour.
curry favour with regulators and make them more
And the
appealing to
market.
consumers. Yeah.
All right, we shouldn't keep Jamie waiting.
No,
And actually, having had that break, I fucking need to go again. So we'll call it a day there. And yeah, you'll get, well, potentially an earlier or a later one, depending on when I get around to publishing it. But we're going to record next Wednesday. So thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for that one.